All right, you are live.
Great. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Eric Leshinsky. I'm the Chief of Comprehensive Planning for the City of Annapolis in the Department of Planning and Zoning. I'm here with Casey Ortiz, our Comprehensive Planner. We've been working closely together on the draft Comprehensive Plan, Annapolis Ahead 2040, which we just released a couple weeks ago. So tonight is the second of two webinars that we're offering to give a broad overview of the plan. We're recording this webinar and we're going to make it available on the project website, which we'll share in a few moments. I just want to start real quick with a question that came in at the end of our last presentation, our last webinar last Thursday, June 22nd, and it came from David Wozniak, who says, his question was, how have you looked at the transition zones between the city of Annapolis and the areas just outside of the city, like Parole, for example? So to answer that question, I would say the comp plan focuses primarily on the areas within the city limits of Annapolis, but it does look beyond those limits in a few cases to understand the context that Annapolis is in. So housing, for example, is one area where we're looking at what's happening around Annapolis, environmental conditions as well. You're going to find some content related to the broader regional and transportation as well. These are regional issues. And the transition zones, I believe, are being referenced in the question, are really the places where the city is transitioning from a more urban, dense development pattern to a more suburban development pattern. And those are places where it's really tough to get around without a car. They're not very safe if you want to walk or ride a bike. Businesses are farther apart, and housing and commercial properties are separated. We're really trying to create a new pattern of development in these areas that will be healthier and more efficient in terms of the land use. And that's a theme in the comprehensive plan that you're going to find throughout. So I'm going to touch on that in the presentation tonight when we talk about land use, but it's an excellent question. So let me get right into it. It's the cover of our draft comprehensive plan we just released. So real quick, the agenda for tonight is pretty simple. We're going to share a few frequently asked questions that we've been hearing, and we're going to tell you a little bit how to participate in the review of the draft plan. We're in the middle of we just started a 90-day public comment period. We're going to give you an overview of what's in the plan, and then we have time for questions. If you'd like to submit questions, however you're watching this evening, through the city's YouTube channel, through Facebook. We'll try to monitor those channels, Casey, as I should say, and try to get to your questions at the end. So first, how long is the draft Annapolis Ahead 2040 document open for review? 90 days. This is 30 more days than what the state of Maryland requires. 60 days is the requirement. We started June 15th at the Planning Commission's regular meeting, and that essentially opened a public hearing on the comprehensive plan. We didn't want to end it in the middle of August, which would have been about 60 days, so we're continuing until mid-September. We think that will provide ample time for people to review the plan and submit comments. Will there be more chances to learn about Annapolis Ahead? Yes, absolutely. We have a whole dedicated website, www.annapolisahead2040.com. If you scroll down, I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, but there's a whole calendar of events there. We're doing 4 in-person events in mid-July and at different locations around the city. You can reach out to Casey at this email address if you have questions or comments. How can I give feedback? So through the website, we're going to share, you'll be able to see how we have chapter specific survey kind of comment links where you can submit questions. We're trying to keep them organized by chapter if possible. since each chapter covers a different aspect of the city. You can also just send emails in to Casey. For the Planning Commission, on the city's website, there's a comment form. In general, whenever testimony is submitted to the Planning Commission, they have a special comment form that you can find on the city's website, if that's how you'd like to submit your comments or present them live at one of the upcoming Planning Commission hearings. Will there be outreach for Spanish-speaking residents? We're absolutely trying to put together a program for that population, and Casey's working on that. If you know of anybody who would benefit from that, please let them know. We're going to put information on the website when we have it. Are you planning to meet with any civic associations, HOAs, neighborhood groups, etc.? We've been meeting with civic associations, neighborhood groups, HOAs throughout the whole planning process, and we're going to continue doing that through this 90-day comment period. We have a few presentations already lined up, and we look forward to hearing from you or anyone who is part of a group that would like to have a tailored presentation to discuss how the comprehensive plan addresses your community. So please be in touch. And then what happens to the draft plan after the 90-day review period ends? Well, we're gathering all the comments. I'm going to share those. We're going to respond to them, putting them into a kind of a comment log. And the Planning Commission makes a recommendation of the comprehensive plan, the draft comprehensive plan, to the City Council. They essentially present it to the City Council, who then moves into an adoption process and can make other recommendations to improve the comprehensive plan if needed. And so the City Council will administer that adoption process. In terms of a schedule, I just want to emphasize where we are here. In June, late June, we're in this 90-day comment period. You can see throughout that the Planning Commission meets regularly every other Thursday. Their next meeting is going to be next Thursday, July 6th, and then 2 weeks after that, and so forth. At each of their meetings, this will be on the agenda. Folks can submit testimony at any of those meetings. We're doing a variety of other outreach like this throughout this period. And then in September, the City Council will receive the draft comprehensive plan, perhaps with recommendations, and they will administer their own adoption process. There's a few other plans that are happening in the background here that have already informed the comprehensive plan. These are kind of specific topic plans, and there are still, at least two of these are still ongoing. The military installation resilience study, which focused on the Navy's presence in Annapolis and how to ensure that they stay here and are protected from climate impacts. That has wrapped up recently, and their recommendations are incorporated into this draft comprehensive plan already. Just want to briefly emphasize that here in Maryland, comprehensive planning is fairly specific and prescriptive. The state provides guidance on how a comprehensive plan should be administered by local governments, whether cities or counties. And it's specific that the Planning Commission of that local jurisdiction shepherds this process forward. It's not something that is initiated by the City Council, so that's unusual. It really begins with the Planning Commission, and then it's the City Council's job to adopt that recommended plan. So that's why it's meeting where we open the public hearing on the draft comprehensive plan. Okay, so important takeaway from this presentation is our dedicated website, AnnapolisAhead2040.com. If you go to that website, it'll take you, that address, it'll take you to the city's website first. It'll direct you to the page where we've been gathering comprehensive plan updates for the last few years. It's going to show you this page where you have a button, review the draft plan. On the right side is where we've been compiling presentations as we do them, so people can watch those later, and they all have a PDF link to the presentation that was presented. If you click on that review draft plan, it takes you to this new splashy new website dedicated specifically to the draft plan that we're making available for review. And clicking on this gray button takes you to the full PDF. It's about 30 megabytes, which you should be able to download just fine. You could have it printed if need be. If you scroll down through that website, you can see a couple of videos that give overview introductions about the comprehensive plan and some of the big ideas that are in the comprehensive plan. You can see, let me actually go out of this, and I'm going to go to the website just to briefly walk you through what that looks like, because there's some information on there that I want to highlight. So here we are. It's loading.
Hey Eric, you're gonna want to share your screen. It's still in the presentation.
Okay, thank you. There we go. How's that? All right, thank you, Casey. So you can see we've divided up we've broken out the various chapters of the comprehensive plan into their own sections here. You can click on any one of these and it'll take you to that particular chapter broken out. Each one has a specific survey. So if I click on land use, it's going to take me to a new page focused on the land use chapter. There's a button to click on that chapter. There's a link to a brief comment card, if you will, where you can submit comments specific to that chapter. And you can scroll through and you can see the goals, the performance measures, the actions for this chapter. They're all in the PDF that you can click on. This is just another way to view them. And going back to the main page, if you scroll all the way down, you can see our calendar of events. Here we are on the 29th doing the webinar. If I were to click to July, you can see we have a number of events coming up. July 6th is the next Planning Commission. And then we have our 4 in-person events, the 11th, the 12th, the 17th, and 18th. They're all at 6 p.m. at different public venues around town. Pip Moyer, Rec Center, the Eastport Annapolis Neck Library on the 12th, Mount Olive Church Community Life Center on the 17th. And then on the 18th, we're at Michael Bush Library on West Street. So hope you'll join us at one of those events. Get back to the presentation now. Share my PowerPoint. Let's see here. All right. Does that look okay, Casey? Great. All right. So on the website, you may have seen that the chapters were divided into the thriving city, the functional city, the adaptive city. These are broad visions for the city that are intended to relate to anybody who's living in the city, any neighborhood. They're not specific to any particular part of the city. They're visions that should be relevant to anybody. And they encompass the chapters of the plan, most of which are required by the state. So we follow the state's guidance on that. Arts and culture is the one chapter that's not required by the state, and it's important to Annapolis. This is the first comprehensive plan that does have a dedicated arts and culture chapter. The appendices, you'll see a link on the website to those. All of these plans listed here were done over the planning period of this comprehensive plan. They're all much more specific topics. They all informed this draft comprehensive plan. 3 of them are the reports from task forces that were organized by the city council, and they all focused on topics relevant to the comprehensive plan. So kind of diving right into the beginning of the plan, you have an introduction, you have a demographic trends chapter. In the introduction, it's important to emphasize that every time we do a comprehensive plan, we think about foundational themes that should really apply to anything we recommend in this plan. And for this one, it's about equity, it's about health and resilience. These are issues and values that are really relevant to the time we're living in today. Of the last few years, they've become increasingly important. Equity is about appreciating the fact that we're more aware today than ever before of racial and economic inequities in how public and private resources are invested in Annapolis communities. We want to be more mindful of how certain communities have not gotten the same opportunity or investment, and we want to recalibrate as we move forward. With health, it's about thinking about how to design a city that actually improves our health, not worsens it. We're coming out of a COVID pandemic. We're still in it to some degree. We became acutely aware of how that pandemic affected some communities more than others, the value of parks and access to nature as a means of addressing our health and rehabilitation. And, there's a lot in this plan that's about how to make a healthy city. And then finally, resilience, I believe it begins with climate change. That's really an existential crisis of our time. Annapolis on the front lines of that. We are dealing with the impacts of climate change every day. And again, some communities are able to adapt to these conditions better than others. We want to be mindful of those communities that are more vulnerable. Lots of images in this comprehensive plan that are from the last year or two to try to ensure that this plan seems current. This image, for example, is from the Juneteenth parade last year, the first parade in the city's history to celebrate Juneteenth Day, and it's an important new holiday for the city. Plan structure, I just mentioned, but then the plan principles give you a guideline for all the goals and recommendations in this plan. Everything that we recommend in this plan should tie back to one of these plan principles. So it's a little bit like an executive summary for the plan. How to use this plan is really just ensuring that it's clear that you don't need to read this plan from front to back at one time. It would be great if you decide to do that, but you don't have to. You can jump around, you can choose what to look at chapter wise. We really wanted to make a plan that was accessible to just about anybody in the city, residents, visitors, people in property, people who don't, business owners, institutions, people who are looking to invest in the city. This is intended to be a resource for understanding where the city is headed. Have some confidence in that. Plan process. We were really heavily impacted by the COVID pandemic. It slowed the process down considerably. We had to pivot to ensure that we were reaching communities in the city. Community input was a really important part of this process, to hear what mattered to residents across the city. And I'm happy to say we found ways of doing that even during COVID. But when you look at our community participation throughout over approximately 3 years, we used a whole variety of technologies and strategies to reach people: in-person events, virtual events, surveys. We leveraged the city's many boards and commissions, which are staffed with volunteers who are very knowledgeable about every facet of the city, and we wanted to leverage that knowledge. So we met with several of the boards and commissions multiple times. We met with many civic associations, neighborhood groups. And then again, I mentioned that the city council initiated 3 different task forces during the time we've been working on this plan, and they informed our recommendations. That one was on housing affordability, one was on the maritime industry, and one was on Forest Drive. You really can't get more relevant than those 3 topics to Annapolis today. When we look at demographic trends, this chapter really tells a story of how Annapolis has changed over the last 10 years since we did our last comprehensive plan. It was adopted in 2009. COVID is obviously a big part of that story, and it highlighted the population of the city and certain populations that were more affected than others. We thought about how to be more conscious and accurate about social vulnerability in the city as a baseline to understand how to be more equitable. And so we use the Centers for Disease Control's social vulnerability matrix to do that. The map shows when you apply the factors that the CDC uses, which are socioeconomic and housing, household composition, and minority and language factors, you end up with a map that highlights certain communities in the darker color that are more socially vulnerable. If people who know Annapolis, it may not be surprising where these communities are. This darkest shaded community along College Creek is the old 4th Ward along Clay Street. You could say this is a community that struggles with a number of social issues and has not had the same level of investment as other parts of the city over time. And there's an environmental justice story to tell here in terms of water access to College Creek. So you'll see this plan, this data used throughout the comprehensive plan to help us understand whether services are being provided equitably and how we could adjust that in the future. As we get into the thriving city, where we talk about municipal growth, land use, and housing, we start with municipal growth, and we really want to clarify that municipal growth is more than just new development. It's about the population that moves here or stays here. It's about the kind of businesses that choose to open in Annapolis that we encourage, and the ones we choose to preserve. This development here on Annapolis Street in West Annapolis, and the image is really an ideal example of the kind of new development we'd like to see, that it complements its surroundings, is mixed use, meaning there's different uses in this building. There's retail on the ground floor and apartments above. So you put people closer to conveniences. They don't have to get in their car to drive places. So municipal growth is also about the kind of development pattern that we want to see. We do provide projections of household growth to give a sense of how Annapolis will change population-wise. We use projections from regional planning organizations and state to understand what we could anticipate in terms of population growth. And the short answer is that Annapolis is going to continue to grow very modestly in the future. We look at what portion of the Anne Arundel County has Annapolis had over time. What is that trend? We look at the pipeline development and capacity the city has for new development. Essentially, what do we know is going to be developed today? And we look at the trend of population growth over the last 20 years to sort of come up with a few scenarios that are reasonable projections, and to understand that we'll be somewhere in the middle. We have economic development themes that really emphasize the sort of niche industries that are already here in Annapolis, that things that people identify with Annapolis. We're not a big city that's going to attract large industries or Fortune 500 companies who need to ramp up their workforce dramatically. I mean, we really want to invest in the things that we're doing well, that people want us, people already associate with Annapolis. So it's our tourism that's evolving. It's small business community and being more inclusive about opportunities to open businesses in the city. It's our maritime industry. Annapolis is very unique in the kind of one-stop shop of maritime services that our city provides, and it attracts a lot of people in that industry. And then our cultural economy is broad. It covers a whole range of creative industries. It generates tremendous amount of value for the city, to our economy and our culture. And we want to understand it and how we could support it as a city. This is just one example for Annapolis Film Festival. The future land use map in our land use chapter is really probably the most central exhibit of the whole comprehensive plan. It's an exhibit that you'll find in just about any comprehensive plan anywhere. It looks at the best use for every parcel of land in the city, and we provide categories or designations for land use types. So every time we do a comprehensive plan, we think about the kinds of land uses that are desirable for the city, and we make changes accordingly. The big changes in this future land use map from our last comprehensive plan 10 years ago, that we're being much more deliberate in where our environmental assets are. You can see all this bright green. These are places that were probably already here in 2009, as many of which are already protected environmental areas. We're calling them environmental enhancement areas on this map. They weren't visible on our last future land use map. They were embedded in other land use categories, whether they were residential or commercial or institutional or industrial in some case. So they were a little bit off the map. We weren't aware of them when you look at the map. Now you can see them, even though many of them are not developable parcels, they add value to adjacent parcels. And we can then plan better knowing that they're there, and be more aware of the value they add. The red areas are also a significant change. Those are our mixed use areas. We had mixed use as a category, a land use designation, the last comprehensive plan, but we have far more mixed use today in this plan, because frankly, it's an efficient way of using our land, our limited land base in the city. So we've taken all of the properties that were identified as commercial land use in the last comprehensive plan, and some other sites that made sense for mixed use, and we designate those as mixed use. There's a theme to mixed use in that many of these are along our major corridors in the city: West Street, Forest Drive, Bay Ridge Avenue, Chinkopin Round Road. And that's because those are corridors that provide services. They have transit in many cases. And so when you talk about mixed use, you're talking about consolidating uses that make sense close to each other, and to create more walkable places. That's really a big idea behind mixed use. Today, our only mixed use area, our truly dedicated mixed use, is our inner West Street area. We have some other areas like the downtown that are definitely mixed use, but not designated as such. So we want to be much more deliberate about mixed use as a development pattern. And we provide performance standards for what that mixed use development should look like. This helps decision makers in the city, or people who are looking to develop in the city, understand what our values are. It helps a group like the Planning Commission that reviews development projects understand what our values are, or what residents who are concerned about development, want to know about a future development. This is what you should look at to understand what a good development should address. And this example from Westgate Circle is certainly not a building that could fit in just anywhere in the city. It's very specific to this location, but it meets just about every performance standard on this list. Some might know it's not. It's one of the few buildings in the city that actually has a green roof. You can't see from here, but it has a number of unique features that make it a good infill mixed use project. And so when we talk about mixed use, many of these redevelopments are going to be, most of them are going to be infill redevelopment, meaning we have an opportunity to correct certain land uses and do something better that's more environmentally responsible, that relates to surrounding context. This is an example, perfect example, our former public works facility on Spa Road. Our public works department for the city recently moved to a new facility on Hudson Street in the Upper West Street area in Parole. And this property will redevelop in the future. We want to make sure we do the right thing with it. So we provide some guidance on what makes for a good infill redevelopment opportunity, a priority on this spread here. We're still in the land use chapter. And then we actually identify about a dozen larger infill sites, infill redevelopment sites that we think will change in the coming years. And we wanted to provide some guidance on what those could be, the things that should be considered as developers and property owners and communities think about the redevelopments. You can look at the plan to see what we suggest for each of these identified sites. One of the ways that we're going to have to move forward following the adoption of this comprehensive plan is to really implement some of these ideas is through zoning reform. And this spread actually comes from the development regulations chapter, which is toward the end of the comprehensive plan. But I wanted to share it here because it's really related to land use. We have a zoning map today here on the right that is not very reflective of our land use map, our future land use map. It's broken up into many smaller areas that you can almost see that over time we've made a lot of piecemeal decisions that don't really reflect a overarching vision. There's a few visions you can see in here, but by and large, it's a very chaotic map. And when we look at zoning reform, we're going to look to make our zoning map more reflective of our future land use map. And we're going to use new zoning strategies, form-based codes in particular, is a way of tailoring our zoning code, which really is what we use to guide what a development will look like. We can be much more prescriptive in what we're going to get through that new development when we use form-based codes. You can see in this diagram, the city today is somewhere between conventional zoning and zoning design guidelines, where we're not providing a tremendous amount of guidance to new development. And so that process of getting to something that is acceptable takes quite a bit of time and struggle, and we can do better, I think, if we work on reforming our zoning guidance. We did a trial of that during this comprehensive plan development process. We did a master plan for the commercial area of West Annapolis, and we looked at how we could rezone that. So on the bottom right, you can see the current zoning districts for that area. It's sort of a puzzle. It doesn't necessarily translate very well intuitively. We came up with a group of new conceptual zoning districts in the upper part of this page that are much more oriented to the existing assets of West Annapolis. So the Village Main Street is a zoning district specific to Annapolis Street that really respects the established residential area to the north and the character of Annapolis Street today. The Village Corridor is responding to Rowell Boulevard, which is very different from Annapolis Street. And it's a higher volume roadway, meaning it carries many more cars, typically an average day. The Village Square acknowledges that the shopping center is a key asset to the community, but could be much more responsive to the needs of the community. It doesn't necessarily need a sea of parking in front. It could have a park space, it can have housing, and still fit well with this community. And then the village transition zone is really trying to transition from the lower density Village Main Street to the higher density Village Corridor. And so you can see it's much more intuitive as a group of zoning districts. We think this type of concept could apply more broadly to the city, other parts of the city, and that's the direction we would be heading in with zoning reform. We're also providing a guidance on when we do future planning for smaller areas of the city. So when we do our next West Annapolis master plan, for example, or we look at typically neighborhood scale situations after we adopt our citywide comprehensive plan. We're going to look at specific smaller areas of the city where we could provide better guidance. And one signature idea for this comprehensive plan is to look at that based on creek sheds. In Ellicott City, I think it was 2019 or 2018, they had a catastrophic flood, and they responded with a master plan for that city that was oriented completely around their watershed, essentially saying everything we do, all of our land use decisions are tied to the quality of our watershed. And we should be thinking the same way here in Annapolis, because water is our signature asset. It brings people here. It generates economy and culture, identity for the city. So a lot of people don't know what watershed they live in. I think that it would be beneficial for everybody to be aware of the watersheds they live in and how their land use decisions impact the quality of the water in the city. That's what this creekshed framework is all about. Housing is really focused on becoming much more specific about what we mean by housing affordability. It's in our conversations with people across the city about housing affordability, there's generally an awareness that Annapolis today is most unaffordable that it's been in its history. It's very challenging for people to move to Annapolis if they're making less than the area's median income, which is around $100,000. So even people who are making, even a household making $100,000 or even over that, have a hard time moving to the city. There just isn't a range of housing types for a range of incomes in the city. And as a city, for us to be sustainable economically, we need, and I would say culturally, we need to be accessible to a range of household incomes. People work in the city, and when they can't live here, they have to drive from farther away. It's unhealthy, and there's so many benefits by enabling people to live closer to where they work. There's a tremendous benefit to that. So we look at housing in that fine grain. We look at the kind of range of housing types that we need in the city, and it really begins by looking at the sort of small scale density that has historically defined Annapolis. Think about duplexes, triplexes, even a 4-unit small building, 4 apartments, in something that looks like a single family house. Annapolis has a lot of these types of buildings, and nationally, there's been a movement to recognize that development codes in cities today generally make it harder to build those kind of small scale apartment units. The reasons are complex, but our zoning codes have changed over time to the point when it's harder to build a lot of the common sense small unit housing that we have historically built. We can't build that today because it's not allowed. And a lot of those unit types have been categorized as missing middle housing. This term was coined by an architect about 10 years ago, and it's really caught on. It's a buzzword within the housing affordability conversation. And this map on the right just shows the situation in Annapolis today, where the yellow areas represent areas zoned for residential use in the city that do not allow a simple duplex to be built. Now, you can build a mother-in-law unit, what we call an accessory dwelling unit, but it would be subordinate to the main residence. You can't build just a simple stacked 2 apartments or side by side. The red areas represent commercial areas that also do not allow a simple duplex. So you look around Annapolis, you see innumerable examples of these types of small density housing units, that many of which could not be built today within our existing zoning code. So we really want to make the changes necessary to allow for these kind of common sense building types to be present here in the city. We get into the functional city. We talk about transportation, community facilities, and arts and culture. And, just want to emphasize that while some might wonder why arts and culture is part of a functional city vision, it's really about acknowledging that it shouldn't be a luxury when our economy is doing well. It should always be present. Arts and culture have been part of the city from its very beginnings 400 years ago. So there's kind of an acknowledgement that it has to be integral to our city when times are good and when they're bad. Transportation policy in the context of this comprehensive plan is really environmental policy. It's all about providing more options to get around the city safely, comfortably, because that has benefits on our environment, on our quality of life, our health. Today, Annapolis is unfortunately a very one-dimensional city from a transportation perspective. You really have a hard time getting around without a personal vehicle. So we're doing a number of things and making a number of recommendations in this plan to improve, to broaden the number of options that somebody has. And this quote, I think, says it all. Almost no matter what you want to do with cities, transportation is the fastest and most cost-effective way of achieving your goals. If you want to reduce CO2 emissions, if you want to advance social equity, if you want to foster small business success, if you want to increase land value, if you want to increase public health, if you want to reduce fatalities and injuries, transport is the place to do it. It's a fact that, dollar for dollar, the investments we make in our transportation system have much, much broader benefits across the city. And our micro mobility program that includes the e-bikes and e-scooters is one way that we've been doing that, by helping people to take cars off the roads, give people a more nimble way of getting around. They've been very effective since we started that program last year. We're very conscious of safety in the city and the alarming trend of increasing pedestrian and cyclist fatalities and injuries that it's both here in Annapolis and nationally. And we have the data to show where those events are happening. You can see the pattern. It's again on major arterial roadways. Not surprisingly, these are the places where we want to change the development pattern. We want to really create more walkable communities along these corridors, so that somebody driving isn't surprised to see somebody crossing the street, or vice versa. Somebody crossing the street isn't alarmed to see somebody driving fast in their vicinity. And so there's a lot we can do to improve safety in the city. We did a really fine-grained analysis of our pedestrian network. We benefited from a analysis tool that our regional planning organization created with us, and we were a test case for this pedestrian infrastructure tool. Allowed us to look at where the gaps in our pedestrian, network are, and produce a map that can help us connect those communities where the gaps exist. Similarly, with our bike network, we updated the recommendations from our 2011 bike master plan. That was the first citywide bike master plan we'd ever done. While many of the recommendations from that plan are still very relevant, some things have changed, and we updated the map. In red, you can see the priority corridors. Many of these are already in progress. We've gotten historic amounts of funding from state and federal sources, but these projects take time. We do them with the adjacent communities and property owners and make sure everybody is on the same page. And then finally, electric mobility is a really obviously current topic in Annapolis and elsewhere. It's a big part of our environmental sustainability as well, trying to reduce our carbon emissions. And we're doing a number of things on electric mobility, but begins by the city leading. We're working to transition our transit fleet, our city vehicles, provide options for getting around that are zero emissions, and some of those are already active today. So this is a trend you're going to be seeing a lot of new investment in the coming years. Community facilities focuses a lot on parks, but it does get into other types of public services. Here you can see the historic conservation initiative at Carr's Beach. City's first beachfront park will be located here. It preserves the last remnant of a very notable, historically Black-owned beach destination that hosted who's who of R&B performers from the 30s to the 70s. And it was a really important accomplishment that we preserved this 6-acre site for a future city park. We have mapping in this chapter that looks at our whole park system in light of social vulnerability and access. We want to be mindful of who can walk to, which communities can walk to a park and which communities can't. We break up the parks into different categories to acknowledge that they don't offer the same things. You have small street end parks, you have large city parks, and these dotted lines are sort of the walk or travel radius to these parks. And so you can, if you spend some time with this map, you'll start to see the gaps outside of the dotted lines where certain communities don't have access to certain types of parks. And we want to improve on that through our equitable investments. Similarly, our water access network, it's a subset of our park system, and it's very, very much active on certain creeks and less active on other creeks. And we can be very, very strategic in where we invest. In fact, there's many projects already happening to improve on our public water access network. And we're working on the city's first ever public water access plan that is informing the comprehensive plan. This map actually comes from that. You can see the social vulnerability, and College Creek is a really signature focus. There's probably about 6 pages just on public water access in this chapter. So you can see, we try to tell the story of how we got to this point where it has become one of the most important issues in the city today. And with education, it's important to acknowledge that the city doesn't own or manage the public schools within the city. It's a responsibility of Anne Arundel County. But what we can do is look at the areas around those schools and improve connections to the schools so kids can walk or bike safely to school. And so these purple areas show the walk radius around each of the city's public schools. And we can use this type of map to prioritize our investments into streetscape improvements, working with Anne Arundel County on all of these projects. We do include a few pages related to public safety, particularly what we can do with Annapolis Police and beyond Annapolis Police to improve public safety. It's a national issue to look for ways to address public safety beyond conventional policing. And it's not typical to talk about public safety and comprehensive plans, but so many of the social issues that trigger crime can be addressed through social policies that are not policing. And so I think our police chief, Jackson, would be the first to acknowledge that his resources can't solve everything. And so it needs to be comprehensive in how we address crime. So we address it through data, understanding where pockets of crime are happening, so we can understand how investments in those places could potentially reverse that trend. And the city is already doing things in this way that we want to acknowledge in this comprehensive plan. The arts and culture chapter is really, broad. It covers historic preservation, cultural institutions, cultural programming, our arts entertainment district. We have a recommendation to expand that arts district. But one of the big themes here is diversifying the narrative, the cultural narrative in the city. This is an example here from the relatively new Museum of Historic Annapolis that it was developed by the Historic Annapolis Foundation. And, it does a great job of highlighting a diverse narrative around Annapolis and tells stories that have not been told adequately over the years. We need to see much more of that. And so the comprehensive plan highlights several different initiatives that are both happening today and will happen in the coming years to expand the narratives and really make Annapolis our cultural economy and cultural scene much more reflective of who lives here and the history of the city. Finally, the last section of the comprehensive plan, the adaptive city, is really our environmental section. It adds two chapters, environmental sustainability and water resources. They're intimately linked. The environmental sustainability chapter specifically is about 50 pages. It's a very robust chapter that covers a lot of ground. And the big theme, though, is climate vulnerability. It's one of the major stories for Annapolis over the last 10 to 20 years. And it's not going away. The city is working hard today to adapt to more climate impacts, whether it's rising sea levels, extreme temperatures, extreme precipitation, coastal storms. Our city dock project is the most high visible effort in this adaptation, but we're doing other things. And you can see this issue threaded throughout the chapter. We have maps that come from other sources that really help us understand the impacts that we could expect in the future. These maps come from the city's recently completed flood plan that our Office of Emergency Management spearheaded, and they use data from the state's climate ready action, the crab map, so-called crab map. They provide very, very fine-grained analysis of the structures that are at risk, the areas that will be inundated as sea level rise continues. So we show for the city and for the Eastport Peninsula in particular, where we have a recommendation to do a dedicated resilience plan. There's a lot of coverage in this chapter about tree canopy expansion and preservation, primarily because urban tree canopy is one of the best tools we have for addressing climate change. It has a tremendous amount of benefits to the city. You can see this image on the lower left, and when you think about those themes at the beginning, the equity, health, resilience, the urban tree canopy addresses all of those issues or themes. But we're having a very difficult time maintaining our existing tree canopy. This map on the right is based on data between 2011 and 2017, and we're showing a loss of tree canopy, and it's primarily in our residential communities, which ironically are the best situated to expand our tree canopy because they have resources and interest, stewardship, capacity to ensure that the trees we plant will survive. So we have a number of recommendations aimed at preserving and expanding our tree canopy. And then our carbon footprint is also a big theme in this chapter. It's related to transportation as well, because and our land use pattern, I should say. I mean, we're a city where our emissions are not coming from major factories or airport or other industrial output. It's primarily from transportation, how we get around the city, our buildings, and you know, this diagram here really tells the story about what do zero carbon cities have in common. They're compact, they're connected, they have clean energy policies, and we're doing a number of things already in this, but electrifying the city and changing our development pattern and ways of getting around are really the major strategies. We have a tremendous asset in our solar park at the former landfill of the city at Waterworks Park. If many of you might not know about that, but at one time it was the largest solar park on a former landfill in the country. I don't know if it still is. And then our water resources chapter looks at water as both a cultural and economic resource, but also infrastructure, you know, our drinking water supply and wastewater. So it covers both of those areas. When you talk about infrastructure, we share a variety of information that comes from other plans that our Department of Public Works is already using to assess our drinking water infrastructure and our wastewater infrastructure. And the goal is really to make it more clear what constitutes that infrastructure. What are we talking about? We're trying to educate people who read this plan to understanding what goes into managing and ensuring good service from that infrastructure, and trying to consolidate the key details from the plans that are used to maintain that infrastructure. So you'll probably learn a few things about our drinking water and wastewater infrastructure from this chapter. Last thing I wanted to share before we see if questions have been submitted. The implementation chapter is tremendously important. It really shows how we're going to implement what's in the vision of this plan. So development regulations highlight some of the policy changes that we can do right away to ensure that we develop according to this plan. Areas of critical state concern is a very brief chapter, but that highlights how the city can position itself to use state funding from various state programs and make sure that we are aligned with state priorities. And then the recommended action matrix, I want to show an example of what that looks like. The aim here is to consolidate all of our goals and recommendations into charts that are easy to read, that summarize everything that we're suggesting in this plan, organized by chapter, and we provide information on the relative timing of each recommendation. I would say, even though we have long-term as one of the criteria for a recommendation, generally most of our recommendations are going to be short-term to mid-term in terms of timing. It's just goes maybe an obvious thing that if it's a long-term recommendation, it's probably not going to happen before we get to our next comprehensive plan. So we were really thinking about actions that would be achievable in the short term or midterm. Cost is really more about relative cost. Want to understand if we need to go well beyond city's resources of staff time or other available funding that we have today, and just give a sense of whether we have to do a lot more work to find the funding to do the project. But we did not provide hard costs for any of the recommendations in here. It's beyond the scope of this type of plan. We have a column for agency, which really speaks to who's responsible for moving the recommendation forward, and then related goals. Many of our recommended actions are cross-referenced in other chapters. So this is just an example of what that looks like when we organize all of these recommendations into this action matrix. It's just intended to be a clear way of seeing the rec. And you could probably go through this chapter on its own and get a very good snapshot of what's in this comprehensive plan. So look forward to hearing your thoughts. Lastly, just want to put a plug in for our upcoming in-person events in mid-July, starting with the Pitt Moyer Rec Center on July 11th. We organize these around the city's wards, just trying to find venues that would be accessible to as many residents as possible. So thank you for listening. I know it's a lot to take in. Look forward to hearing your thoughts on the comprehensive plan. Just going to ask Casey, have we seen any comments come in?
No, we didn't receive any comments in the chat. But again, if you have any comments, please check out www.annapolisahead.com or annapolisahead2040.com. And feel free to reach out to me at csortiz@annapolis.gov. If you just have any comments on the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, we're going to be posting this presentation on the comprehensive plan website. So hopefully it's a resource for folks. But please do visit the website, download the plan, comment on it. Feel free to provide live testimony at one of the upcoming Planning Commission meetings. Come to our in-person events and talk to us in person. We look forward to hearing from you, and yeah, hope you enjoy the plan. I think that's it for now. Thank you for listening.